Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This History with Sai here today to carry on with our discussion on the US civil rights topic. As always, it's important to remember that this is the lesson catered towards the student level, so the content will provide some key knowledge and a video that will be dedicated to practicing our historical skills as we go on throughout the series. If you haven't already, do check out our previous videos where we've gone over civil rights in the very early year with a good overview, and of course, then more to the present with the 1920s and for this video, the impact after the Great Depression and into the New Deal era. With all that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So, as we established in our previous lesson, the government is now intervening. They're trying to solve the problems of unemployment, of collapsed banks, of people losing their houses and property. But we need to understand how this affects African Americans. So that's what we're going to explore in today's video, and we're going to get right into it. So, was this a new deal for the African American people? Well, as we said, until this New Deal era began, the African Americans always supported the Republican Party. They saw them as the ones for their party, given Abraham Lincoln had been the one to end slavery for them during the Civil War, and Ulysses S. Grant had been the one to use the Enforcement Acts to try and move the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, from the South when they attacked them in the 1870s. However, there's been a lot of stagnation and problems, and they finally decided to give the Democrats a try, despite their historic racism. And this indeed was the case. In 1936, some 75% of eligible African American voters were supporting the Democratic Party. Many of them were turning to Roosevelt because his spending programs, as we established, were going to give them that relief they desired. And not just fear, as we mentioned, but also there were many others, with the WPA, with the AAA, the Triple C, TVA, the whole alphabet agency coming to the fore and really trying to help the African American community and workers in America at large out. However, Roosevelt, when it came to civil rights, he didn't really do much for the civil rights case in prior years. And if anything, his administration is going to bow to discrimination as time goes on. In order to pass this New Deal legislation, he needed support from those Southern Democrats. And as we established, the Southern states in particular were still rooted in the Confederacy myth that actually slavery was not supposed to be lost, and therefore they were really buying into that myth and reality. And it's a real big problem for him as a leader. If anything, it was Roosevelt's own wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who did more to make a public stand for civil rights than he did. For instance, the New Deal programs were discriminating against the African Americans. The NRA, or the National Industrial Recovery Act, for example, was offering whites the first chance at the jobs rather than a separate equal measure for African Americans. Furthermore, it was also paying African Americans less than the whites as well. The Federal Housing Authority refused to give African Americans mortgages, especially when they tried to buy them in predominantly white neighborhoods. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, were actually still segregating many camps, many Hoovervilles as well, where they could. And lastly, the Social Security Act did not include African American jobs they typically worked in. So those construction and industrial jobs they came to work up north, they weren't getting any insurance while they were doing their work for them. Agriculture as well was particularly grim and neglected. Many sharecropper communities and systems still existed, even though the Agricultural Adjustment Administration was trying to reduce these problems. They weren't really very successful of that. White landlords were still making lots of money by leaving land unfilled rather than putting it back into production by hiring African American workers. As a result, 100,000 African Americans lost rights to live on these lands between 1933 and 1934. Even more painful was Roosevelt did not support the anti-lynching bill the NAACP put forward, and also did little to actually abolish the poll tax that still prevented many poor African Americans from voting. All because he wanted the support of these Southern Democrats, despite having over 400 seats and a massive, massive majority no president has seen for decades. Although we have to give some credit where it's due, where the National Youth Administration, who, with a black educator in Mary McLeod Bethune, she actually made some efforts to ensure that their funds were spread out. We also had the Workers' Pension Authority was colorblind at this time, and therefore the African Americans in northern cities did receive a fair share of the work relief programs they should have got. We also had Harold Ikes, who was a strong supporter of civil rights and made sure that several African Americans who on his staff had the federal funds necessary to go to schools and have hospital service even in the southern states. However, we can't overlook the fact that some 500,000 African Americans were still out of work in the southern states. That was despite things like the National Industrial Recovery Act in June 1933 trying to assist them. Key problem came from the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933. This was meant to aim to help farmers by cutting down farm production to increase food prices. However, the less production meant there was less work for these thousands of African American sharecroppers. And this was worsened by something called the Wagner Act of 1935, which actually meant that black labor unions were harmed by the monopolies being legalized. By encouraging unionization, Wagner Act raised the number of insiders, those with jobs, who had the incentive and ability to exclude outsiders, those without jobs. So, with their high wages negotiated, the employers were less likely to hire outsiders and therefore made sure the insiders, who were white, got their jobs protected instead. These monopolies on the labor unions meant that in effect the African American were now excluded from having a lot of work that these unions now dominated. What about the spending programs as a whole? Well, actually, they were channeled away from the poorest people of America, those African Americans who do live in the South. We actually have clear evidence that the bulk of New Deal spending went to the western and eastern states rather than the southern states, because previous election returns had been relatively close, and Roosevelt was quite self serving and was focusing on winning his following elections rather than appealing and helping all Americans. Therefore, the New Deal policies, while they weren't conceived with racial intent on the surface, they did have very racist consequences. It's unsurprising then that many African Americans did protest about the treatment they suffered under the New Deal. And in fact, they actually found more support from very left wing groups, especially communists, for gaining equality rather than for actually from the government themselves. There's a key case I want to make note of, which is the Scottsboro case. The Scottsboro case is a very important case in American history that spans across this New Deal era from 1931 to 1937. It concerned 9 African American men who were falsely accused of sexually assaulting 2 white women on board a train in Scottsboro, Alabama in 1931. These 9 men were unemployed, seen as illegally riding the rails while they were looking for work. They were taken off of the freight train and they were held on a minor charge. However, the Scottsboro deputies found 2 white women and they pressured them into accusing the 9 men of sexually assaulting them while on board the train. This charge led to an explosive outburst of this accusation, and within 2 weeks there was lots of pressure, and the Scottsboro Nine, as they were now called, were imprisoned, convicted, and sentenced to death, except for one, Leroy Wright, who was only 13. He instead was going to be sentenced to life imprisonment. It wasn't the government who supported these 9 men during their struggles. It actually was the American Communist Party. The American Communist Party was focusing on campaigning against the racism in these southern states, and especially the exploitation African Americans men were suffering. And so it took on the case and made sure through large activist efforts to create a mass defense movement for the men. It brought in their legal arm, the International Labor Defense, to represent the 9 men. After 2 trials in front of an all-white jury, which was very, very one-sided in the Alabama press, the ILD and the Communist Party began a national protest campaign to overturn the conviction. They were conducting street marches, national and international speaking tours, and even writing songs to persuade people that this was unjust. Because of their actions, the Communist Party actually gained a lot of respect and support from African American communities, not just in the South, but in America as a whole. For instance, when they went to Washington, D.C., the Communist Party stopped at segregated restaurants to stage sit-ins against discrimination, helping to turn the campaign into a trial of the system of segregation and racism in America as a whole. We'll see how sit-ins in the 1950s and 60s becomes a key tactic many African Americans will turn to get more support in time. Eventually, the NAACP also joined the cause and worked to rally people to support the Scottsboro Nine and even made a formal and complete defense committee. Eventually, one of the white women, Ruby Bates, came forward to reveal her testimony had been a lie and that she had been pressured, along with Price, into accusing these 9 men. And therefore, actually, she joined the campaign to save their lives, which they did eventually succeed in doing. However, these 9 men, it would be a long time before they were all fully free from prison. In fact, it would be 20 long years before the final of the 9 was finally released. This was all sheer proof of the inequality that was in America and how the Jim Crow segregationist system would be a very difficult thing to defeat. But mass movement actions, especially those that combined African American with white support, could be really successful in finding a way to overthrow it. And I do want to highlight here that it's when the grassroots movements are rising up that change has happened, whereas the government, despite all their talk of New Deal progression and change and transformation, they're still very neglectful on this issue, and that can't be overstated. Sometimes the people have to rise up in their movements rather than rely on the government to do that for them. So, I hope you found this video quite useful as always. I hope you really enjoyed this lesson here on the impact of the New Deal on the African American community. We'll carry this on as always in our series going forward as we enter the Second World War. And also in our next lesson, we'll take stock and make an assessment of how things have changed for the African Americans up until this point. We talked about quite a lot of history between 1917 and getting up to here in 1941 as the Second World War is about to begin. As always, do feel free to subscribe, comment, do let me know how you find the series down below. We'll be asking some key questions in our following video, so make sure, of course, you're brushing up on it for that. And we bring things together at this bit of a junction point here as we get into things before the Second World War. But we'll find out about all that in the following video. Thank you, as always, for watching. This has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.